Right, so you can always tell what a state really believes in by who it chooses to punish. And lately, Britain has been very clear on this. A Palestinian-British doctor posts political comments about Gaza, and suddenly it's police at the door, the tribunal on standby, and half the press trying to read meaning into the jewellery around her neck. Meanwhile, Britons who travelled to join the Israeli military during the assault on Gaza, well, the law for dealing with that already exists. It's been on the books since the 19th century, in fact. It should have triggered investigation the moment the UK recognised Palestine. Instead, the state did nothing. Civil society had to step in where government refused. So no, this isn't about public confidence or professional standards or whatever phrase they're hiding behind this week. This is about power deciding who's allowed to speak and who's allowed to kill. Right, so there's a point at which an old belief stops being credible, not because of an argument or a shift in theory, but because reality stops matching it. For years, people have repeated the line that the British state applies the law fairly, that public institutions act impartially, that professional regulators are insulated from political pressure, and that policing is concerned with safety rather than narrative. That belief does not survive contact with what has taken place in Britain around Gaza, though. Nothing like it. It collapses the moment you place two recent developments besides one another in actual fact and look directly at them. A Palestinian-British doctor was arrested in her home, interrogated and professionally threatened over speech. There were no allegations of clinical harm. There were no complaints from patients. The issue was the content of her political expression regarding Gaza. That's one. Around the same time, though, a human rights organisation submitted an application in a UK magistrate's court seeking to prosecute British nationals who had joined the Israeli military during the assault on Gaza. The law governing that conduct already exists. It's called the Foreign Enlistment Act. It prohibits British citizens from enlisting in the armed forces of a foreign power engaged in hostilities against a state with which the UK is at peace. Palestine has been formally recognised by the UK. The conditions for that law to apply are very much present, therefore. Yet the state did not initiate any investigation, and still hasn't, has it? The organisation has had to act instead of the state, in the state's place. It's not a coincidence. This is not anything of that sort. This is the structure of enforcement now. The doctor's speech was treated as dangerous. British involvement in military operations in Gaza was treated as irrelevant. The state used police powers and regulatory authority rapidly and aggressively when a Palestinian expressed political dissent. The state declined to use police or prosecutorial powers at all when British citizens allegedly participate in foreign military action and are doing so in a recognised conflict zone, as they are if they're fighting for Israel right now. The difference between those responses is the point at which the old beliefs failed, isn't it? The law's not disappeared, it's simply been reallocated. The case involving the doctor is very straightforward. Dr. Rama Al-Adwan is a medical professional. Her work involves trauma and orthopaedic care. There were no findings of unsafe practice anywhere in relation to that. The tribunal charged with determining clinical fitness had already stated that she did not present a risk to patients. The reason her case continued was solely the interpretation of her speech. She'd expressed grief and political anger over the events in Gaza. She is British Palestinian. She is surely entitled to have something to say on such matters, you would think. However, that speech was treated not as political expression, but as a threat to public confidence. Police became involved. A home search took place. Headlines followed that focused not on her work, but on symbols and identity. She was not treated as a doctor with political views at all. She was treated as a problem that needed to be neutralised. And this is the policing of identity through institutional power. The state and its regulators and its aligned media actors, like the media, acted together to define Palestinian political expression as inherently something to be suspicious of. The content of the speech was secondary to that. The identity of the speaker was the issue at the end of the day. When a Palestinian expresses grief regarding Palestinian death, the state treats that expression as instability requiring containment. It does not require a law prohibiting Palestinian identity to achieve that outcome either. It only requires that enforcement be directed consistently in one direction. The case involving British participation in Israeli military operations demonstrates the reverse of that. The law governing this scenario predates the current conflict by well over a century. And the criteria it sets out are very clear. If a British citizen enlists in the armed forces of a foreign state engaged in hostilities against another state with which Britain is not at war, recognised or not recognised at the time, not relevant. That conduct is illegal. The UK has recognised Palestine, albeit recently. Israel's actions in Gaza and the West Bank constitute hostilities within that now recognised territory. British citizens did serve with the Israeli military during this period. The law applies, and indeed raises the question I fancy regarding whether or not any active British participants are still out there, since Britain recognised the state of Palestine. And yet the state has not moved on this whatsoever. There's been no announcement, there's been no inquiry, there's been no ministerial statement, no public safeguarding language, no professional regulator issuing guidance about public confidence. If one of these people fighting out in Israel right now happens to be a doctor, just like Dr. Al-Adwan, I'd be much more concerned about being served or treated by one of them than I would be about her. There's been no police investigative posture, no prosecutorial interest at all, though, has there? It was being left to civil society, another organisation entirely, to compile the evidence, to seek the legal counsel, to submit an application to a court to begin proceedings. The state did not fail to see the issue, it has simply declined to act on it. So this was not oversight, this was deliberate policy. And so at this point, the structure ought to have become a little bit more clear for more of us, shouldn't it? The British state, its regulators, its media ecosystem act in alignment to police Palestinian political expression, all while shielding British alignment with Israeli military action. This alignment does not require conspiracy theory. It's not conspiracy at all. It simply requires shared assumptions about whose interests are normal and whose are more threatening. A Palestinian speaking about Gaza is treated as a national security concern. A British national fighting for Israel is treated as a personal matter. When this pattern repeats across law enforcement and professional regulation and public discourse, it becomes state logic, wrong as it is. Recognition of Palestine's statehood is treated as symbolic. It carries no enforcement weight at all. The sovereignty of Israel, however, is treated as materially real, and public institutions behave accordingly. Sovereignty exists, therefore, only when backed by enforcement. Where enforcement is selective, sovereignty becomes selective. The British state has recognised Palestine on paper. In practice, it has positioned Palestinian identity as a category requiring surveillance when expressed politically. Seems rather racist when you put it in such terms, doesn't it? The language surrounding Dr. Al-Adwan's case demonstrates this, though. The justification for intervention was framed in terms of trust, professional responsibility, and community cohesion. These terms function as placeholders that allow the state to censor speech without stating the reason directly. They imply that Palestinian expression is destabilising or risky, not because the content is illegal or simply incorrect, but because of who is expressing it and in what context. This is how speech gets criminalised without passing a law against it. Meanwhile, the absence of language around British involvement in Israeli military activity shows the inverse. No warnings, no cautions, no concern for destabilisation there, no urgency at all. The silence is not neutral, therefore it's protective. It indicates which forms of violence the state recognises as acceptable and which forms of dissent it decides are dangerous. And place side by side the ICJP case, the body taking these Britons fighting for Israel to court, and the criminalisation of Dr. Rama Al-Adwan, expose the British state's use of law as a political instrument rather than a neutral standard. There's no argument left to make. The structure is visible in outcomes. The law still functions, it's simply not functioning for everyone. So this is not about future consequences. This is not about what might happen if the pattern continues. This is about what is already true. Palestinian identity is being governed in Britain as a security matter. British complicity in Israeli military action is being treated as unremarkable. That's the legal and political order that currently exists. The state's bet is that the public will either not notice or will accept it. The language tells you everything if you listen for it. The enforcement tells you even more. The question is not whether the system is fair, it's whether the public is willing to act as though it is, after having seen what it does. And the law at the centre of this is not vague, it's not new, it's not a matter of interpretation. The Foreign Enlistment Act has been in place for over a century. Its purpose is very, very clear: to prevent British citizens from serving in the armed forces of a foreign state, engaged in conflict with a state the United Kingdom is not at war with. It's not a hard one to get your head round. That law applies regardless of personal identity and ideology or citizenship status beyond British nationality. If a British citizen takes part in the military operations of a foreign power in a conflict zone recognised as belonging to another state, the law is engaged. It should be automatic. The UK recognises Palestine. Israel's military actions in Gaza and the West Bank take place within the territory of a state that Britain has acknowledged. British nationals served the Israeli military whilst those actions were taking place. The legal trigger is already present. No parliamentary motion is required to activate it. Enforcement would require a police investigation and a prosecutorial decision. Nothing more. And yet the state has done absolutely nothing. The silence was not the silence of doubt over this. The law is clear. It was the silence of political alignment. The British state has distinctive and long-standing strategic and political ties with Israel. God knows we know it, don't we? Those ties shape how law enforcement ends up behaving now, though. When the conduct in question aligns with the state's foreign policy position, the law doesn't get applied. When the conduct in question challenges that alignment, though, enforcement appears very, very quickly and rather decisively. And that is the function of selective application. It's the state choosing which laws are real and which are symbolic, when to enforce and when to turn a blind eye. The organisation that submitted the application to prosecute under the Foreign Enlistment Act, the ICJP, did so because the state wouldn't. Civil society should not need to force the state to enforce its own laws, and yet here we are. The state still has the power to act, it has simply declined to. The state did not fail, it chose. This was choice. A government that believes its enforcement decisions are based on principle would have responded to the evidence of British nationals serving in a foreign army by opening an investigation. It should have been automatic. But it didn't bother. The same government, however, responded to political speech by a Palestinian doctor by treating her as a matter for criminal and professional discipline. The difference lies in what the state perceives as a threat, and anything remotely anti-Israel is apparently a threat. Bye-bye to freedom of speech and freedom of expression by default. A Palestinian expressing political dissent is seen as destabilising. A British national serving in the armed forces of Israel, potentially committing genocidal acts, is seen as normal. That's not confusion, that's policy. This is where sovereignty has to be addressed plainly. Recognition of Palestine as a state is meaningless unless the laws that protect recognised states are enforced. If Britain recognises Palestine but does not enforce domestic laws that prevent British citizens from participating in military actions against that state, then recognition is symbolic only, and this was an argument made by many at the time, that this would be the case. In practice, the British state is treating Israeli sovereignty as real and Palestinian sovereignty as conditional. Recognition on paper is public relations. Recognition in law is enforcement. Enforcement is absent. Therefore, recognition is meaningless. This is not simply an international legal issue. It has domestic consequences too, because when the state selectively applies the law, it creates categories of citizenship. There are citizens whose rights are secure and citizens whose rights are conditional, and that is racist. Those categories map onto political identity. Palestinian identity in Britain gets treated as a subject of suspicion when expressed politically. The rights of British nationals involved in Israeli military structures are not subjected to the same scrutiny. The distribution of legal protection is not even. It ends up graded. The state expects the public not to see it, though, especially when the mainstream media never presents such things in those terms. It expects the public to be distracted by the procedural language surrounding professional standards and community cohesion and public trust. It assumes most people will not read the legislation, will not follow the tribunal proceedings, will not notice who is investigated and who is not, and will not place the cases next to each other to compare and contrast. Easily done when one story gets a lot of media attention and the other gets totally ignored. But once they're placed next to each other, the pattern becomes undeniable. The law is not being applied, it's being used. And there's no need to ascribe hidden motives or theorise about covert agendas here either. The pattern of outcomes is enough in and of itself. British nationals aligned with Israeli state violence face no legal or regulatory obstruction. Palestinians expressing dissent face immediate institutional response. That's the operational structure of the current British legal environment. And once a system of law begins to operate like that, it's no longer a neutral framework at all. It's a mechanism of political control, dressed up in all the usual administrative language. The case of Dr. Rami al-Adwan is sadly not unique. It is how the British state now handles Palestinian identity when it crosses into public life. Her story has simply been one the mainstream media have latched onto and made a meal out of. She's a trauma and orthopaedic doctor. Her record shows no clinical failings, no patient complaints, no evidence that her professional conduct has ever harmed anyone. She is exactly what our ailing NHS needs more of. The issue was about her speech. She spoke about the war in Gaza. She posted comments that reflected anger and grief and solidarity with her fellow Palestinians under bombardment. That was enough for the state to apparently act against her. Her words were treated as a matter for the police. She was arrested in her home. She was questioned under suspicion of malicious communications and incitement. The regulator referred her to a tribunal despite having already ruled that she posed no risk to patient safety. Nothing in her professional conduct had changed at all. All that changed was the political temperature of the moment and the pressure placed on institutions to demonstrate that they were dealing with Palestinian speech. From that point, the sequence followed a pattern Britain has seen before. Once an individual from a marginalised background becomes the focus of political hysteria, the media moves in to define the story. Instead of reporting on her record of the legal process, they turned her appearance and her identity into the subject. An example of such coverage came from the execrable GBBs, GB News, where their coverage fixated on personal details. A necklace with the number 7 on it, and they declared she's clearly celebrating October 7th as though this was some sort of evidence for that. It's ridiculous. But as we know, this is the agenda at play. Whilst all of this was happening, though, NHS England had already directed trusts to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, a definition that, as we know, includes examples referencing Israel and conflating criticism of that state with anti-Semitism itself, a falsehood that even the IRA definition's author has said as much about. It had instructed all staff to undergo new anti-racism training framed around that definition. So far from being an administrative response to discrimination, it instead created a mechanism that can be used to reclassify political criticism of a state as professional misconduct, and it's very difficult to conclude that the attention Dr. Al-Adwan has received has not been used to push such an agenda. And once that framework exists, any Palestinian or pro-Palestinian worker in the NHS operates under a form of conditional speech. The boundaries of what is safe to say are no longer set by ethics or law or even basic human rights, but by political expediency as enforced. And the logic behind it, unfortunately, is very simple. When Palestinian workers speak about Palestine, institutions will move to contain them. When others express unqualified support for Israel, the same institutions will stay silent. It's not that one view is officially banned and another endorsed. It is that only one view is treated as compatible with professional life. And that distinction is enough to achieve censorship without even admitting that censorship is the goal. The police raid on Dr. Al-Adwan's home demonstrates how far this logic has travelled. The action was not about preventing harm. It was about signalling compliance. When the police arrest a Palestinian for speech, regulators and media outlets interpret that as confirmation that political solidarity with Gaza is dangerous territory. The case becomes the example. It tells every other worker what not to say. And the result is not public safety, it's more fear. Meanwhile, the same enforcement intensity is nowhere to be found when the subject is British citizens joining the Israeli military, literally joining the IDF. There are no dawn raids on them, there are no suspensions, there's no calls for professional reviews in their lives. The double standard cannot be more plain once pointed out, and that's the trick with it. One side of the conflict is policed through coercion and covered ad nauseum by pliant client media, the other is protected through omission. This is how political alignment becomes embedded in the operations of the state. In Dr. Al-Adwan's case, the language of public confidence was used repeatedly. That phrase has become the standard justification for punitive measures against political speech. It sounds neutral, but it's not. It implies that Palestinian identity itself undermines trust, that the act of expressing grief or solidarity is incompatible with professional credibility. It moves the definition of misconduct from action to emotion. And once emotion is under surveillance, silence becomes the only safe behaviour. This is what coercion looks like in practice. It's not the creation of new laws. It's the reinterpretation of existing ones to serve current political needs. It is regulators, employers and police deciding that their role is to protect institutional reputation by suppressing dissent. It's the alignment of media coverage that repeats the logic of the state until it becomes common sense in our heads. By the time the individual case is resolved, the damage ends up already having been done. Dr. Al-Adwan's treatment shows how the state defines risk. Political speech by a Palestinian is treated as a threat to stability. Participation by British nationals in a foreign military assault is not. The category of risk has been detached from harm and attached to narrative. That's the essential shift. Once risk is defined by political convenience rather than by actual danger, law enforcement stops being about protection and instead becomes about control. This approach is effective because it relies on plausible deniability. No minister has to declare that Palestinians will be investigated for speech. The institutions will do it automatically because the cultural signal has already been sent. The message is clear. Expressions of Palestinian solidarity will be scrutinised. Expressions of allegiance to Israel will be ignored. And enforcement follows predictably. The result is not a collapse of the rule of law, but its repurposing. The mechanisms all remain intact. They simply point all in one direction now. And because the system still looks functional, because tribunals are held, because procedures are followed and reports are written, it can maintain the appearance of fairness even while operating as an instrument of discrimination. This is what makes the parallel with the ICJP case unavoidable. When civil society has to step in to prosecute alleged war crimes, while the state spends all of its energy criminalising a doctor for speech, the distribution of power ends up being laid bare. Law in Britain is still active. It's simply being used to protect those aligned with power and punish those who challenge it. It isn't very democratic at all, therefore, is it? When these two cases are placed side by side each other, the structure of British state power becomes visible without any further need for interpretation. The doctor's case shows how dissent is being policed. The ICJP case shows how complicity is being protected. Together they reveal how law is now being used to reinforce political alignment rather than to uphold equal citizenship. In the doctor's case, enforcement began immediately. Police intervention, regulatory escalation, public censure. The justification was presented as maintaining trust, protecting cohesion, and preserving professional standards. Yet her record was clean. Her patients were unharmed. There was no clinical issue to resolve here. The only thing under examination was her voice. She spoke from the position of a Palestinian who recognises the reality of Palestinian suffering. The state treated that speech as an instability that had to be managed. In the ICJP case, the state refused to move at all. The law was already present, though. The violations alleged did not require new legal interpretation. British nationals served in the armed forces of a foreign state engaged in hostilities on recognised Palestinian territory. The Foreign Enlistment Act applies in that situation. The state could have investigated. It chose not to. It could have issued guidance. It chose not to. It could have made a statement. It chose not to. Civil society had to act instead because the government chose not to. The state intervened where power was challenged and withheld intervention where power was supported. The enforcement was not determined by harm. It was determined by political alignment. This is now the governing logic. A state aligned with Israel will not treat British participation in Israeli military action as misconduct, it seems. A state that considers Palestinian political expression a threat will treat speech as an object of surveillance. The law does not need to be rewritten. It only needs to be applied differently depending on the subject. The law being applied differently undermines the rule of law itself, though. And that is why the doctor was criminalised for speech and the soldiers were not investigated for potential genocide participation. The law is not malfunctioning here. It's operating precisely as the state intends, even if that isn't how the law was intended to be used. The British state, its regulatory bodies, and its media ecosystem act in alignment to police Palestinian speech while shielding British alignment with Israeli military action. This alignment has been in place for decades. Only now, in this era of alternative and independent media and social media, is it being publicly highlighted and called out. What has changed is that this is now visible to the public. The contradiction can no longer be hidden behind rhetoric about fairness and neutrality and the headlines of billionaire media moguls. This is where sovereignty enters the picture. Recognition of Palestine means nothing if the state that recognises it refuses to act when its citizens take part in military operations against it. Sovereignty is not a diplomatic phrase. It is a relationship that is enforced through law. When the law is not enforced, sovereignty is denied in practice, even if it is acknowledged in speech. And where Palestine is concerned, frankly, we knew this is what would happen under this Starmer regime, isn't it? But at the same time, Palestinian identity in Britain is treated as a matter requiring supervision as well. The state does not need to formally declare that Palestinian expression is a security concern. The treatment of the doctor did that in and of itself. The directives to NHS staff did that. The media framing did that. The arrest did that. The suspicion did that. The public has been shown who is permitted to speak and who must remain cautious in what they say. This is where the consequences become real. When one part of the population is treated as conditionally legitimate, that population does not forget. When the law is used to enforce silence on one group and grant impunity to another, the meaning of equality itself becomes hollow. A state does not need to announce that citizenship is tiered for it to be true. The behaviour of its institutions communicates that quite clearly to us. Placed side by side, the ICJP case and the treatment of Dr. Rami al-Adwan expose the British state's use of law as a political instrument rather than a neutral standard. It's no longer surmised to be the case, or theoretical even. It's already happening before our eyes. Palestinian identity is being policed. British military alignment with Israel is being shielded. The law has not failed. It's just been repurposed to suit that scenario. There is no need to speculate about what may happen next. It's enough to look at what has already happened. A doctor was arrested because her grief was politically inconvenient. British nationals who fought in foreign military during the assault on Gaza have not been investigated because their actions were politically useful. The system is functioning exactly as designed for the interests it serves, and the state expects you to accept this. It expects you to believe that neutrality is intact, that there's nothing wrong. It expects you to ignore the difference in enforcement here. It expects you to internalise the silence. So, are you going to do that? Well, this channel won't be. The record is clear. The cases are documented. The outcomes are public. The law has not disappeared. It's just been allocated to suit the whims of you-know-who. And once you see it for who it is and what it has been allocated for and who's been allocated against, the character of the British state in this moment becomes impossible to unsee, doesn't it? Well, NHS England rolls out the IRA definition still further. It's become something of a political time bomb for Keir Starmer, though. So do check out how he's having a rather bad day over that IRA definition. Oh dear, how sad, never mind. In this video recommendation here is your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.